Good morning. Do you enjoy singing? Like the songs that we would have just sung together? Always an uplifting part of our worship together. Just think how exciting it's going to be when we do get the chance to be back together, and not only knowing that we are singing together as we follow along with the video recording, but actually raising our voices to God and encouragement to each other in the same building, in the same auditorium. We look forward to that point in time, and as Ken mentioned, we will be able to, Lord willing, do that next Sunday, May the 10th, with at least as many people as are both able and safe in coming to worship in a collective group. The lesson this morning, as you can see projected behind me, is listed as a mystery journey, and that's because life is a mystery journey. This falls into the category of the series that's not really a series, but those lessons that I title as Mark's Musings. Those come about when I read a passage and I think, what does that mean to me? What am I supposed to get out of that? What intrigues me in that particular passage? And this passage is that way. I want to raise maybe three thoughts this morning based on the reading in Luke chapter 24. If you want to turn there, we're going to read verses 13 through verse 35 and read that whole account and then come back and make the points that we want to make. Starting in verse 13 of Luke 24, we read, "And behold, two of them were going that very day to a village named Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were conversing with each other about all the things which had taken place. And it came about that while they were conversing and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them. But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And he said to them, 'What are these words that you are exchanging with one another as you're walking?' And they stood still, looking sad. And one of them, named Cleopas, answered and said to him, 'Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem and unaware of the things which have happened here in these days?' And he said to them, 'What things?' And they said to him, 'The things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priest and our rulers delivered him up to the sentence of death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it is the 3rd day since these things happened. But also some women among us amazed us. When they were at the tomb in the early morning and did not find his body, they came saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. And some of those who were there with us went to the tomb and found it just exactly as the women also had said, but him they did not see. And he said to them, 'O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and to enter into his glory?' And beginning with Moses and with all the prophets, he explained to them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. And they approached the village where they were going, and he acted as though he would go farther. And they urged him, saying, 'Stay with us, for it's getting toward evening, and the day is nearly over.' And he went in to stay with them. And it came about that when he had reclined at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it, and breaking it, he began giving it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. And they said to one another, 'Were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking to us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?' And they arose that very hour and returned to Jerusalem, and found gathered together the 11 and those who were with them, saying, 'The Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon.' And they began to relate their experiences on the road and how he was recognized by them in the breaking of the bread." What a great story, really, from all angles of looking at that story. It's a wonderful story. There was a road that went west from Jerusalem, about 7 miles to Emmaus. The town of Emmaus, if they have the correct location of that, still exists. The ruins are in a national park there. There was a spring in that town, and they had possibly many things that would have been associated with the spring and being in the town of Emmaus. And Jesus is walking along, and it says with two of them. Two of whom? I mean, these weren't just random disciples even. These were disciples that were with the others who were huddled and who were hiding, who had heard the report, as they indicated later, the report from the women who had been at the grave that said that Jesus was alive. So they had been huddled with these other disciples, not having known that Jesus was resurrected, not having felt the impact of that yet in their lives. And they left that room, headed toward Emmaus, and Jesus joined up with them. Some things that are interesting to note. These were disciples. These weren't people who didn't believe. These were people who had seen Jesus. These were people who had followed Jesus. They had walked with him. They had heard the things that he had said, and yet they did not recognize him. They thought he was a stranger. They thought he was not only a stranger, but he was an uninformed stranger. They couldn't believe that he didn't know the things that they were already talking about amongst themselves. And so I wondered as I looked at that lesson for myself, are there times in my life where maybe I don't see Jesus? I don't recognize Jesus? You realize how easy that is? To miss him when we get diverted our attention like Peter did when he stepped out of the boat and took his eyes off Jesus? When we find ourselves amongst disappointment or discouragement, the things that are happening around us, or in a time like this with COVID, when fear seems to run rampant, sometimes we don't see him. Though we are disciples, though we are believers, we may still suffer the discouragement and the fear and not recognize that he is there gently walking with us every single step of the way. He has never left. And he wants us to understand that. And so when he asked them, he says to them, you foolish ones, foolish people. Not ignorant, though he's going to explain the word more detailed to them. They didn't understand all the things, but he says, you should know better. That's the idea of foolish. It isn't just what I don't know, it's what I'm not making application of. They had heard the things that Jesus had taught, and he says, you should know better than this. You ever had that conversation with one of your children? They're doing something, and it isn't a matter that they don't know that it's wrong, and so what you say to them is, you know better than to do that. That's what Jesus is saying. You know better. You should not be hanging your head in fear and disappointment and discouragement. You know the things that were said about me, and you should understand that. And he expounds to them the scriptures. And he's going through and taking the prophecies and the things that were taught by God to show that all of these things had to happen. He says, you should have understood that the Christ had to die in order that he could be raised again. And yet they failed until later to recognize him. How often do we fail to see as he talks to us through his word? And maybe part of the issue is we don't allow him to talk frequently enough to us through his word. And so we are foolish on occasion. We know better, and yet we are like they are. And it says of them in verse 17 that they stood still with sadness. You ever just try to get a picture of that? Can't you just see as Jesus comes up and he starts to ask them a question, and they just stop in their tracks and they look so dejected, and it's almost as if they don't even know what to say. And they just kind of drop that head, discouraged and sad, and they stand there. And then they made the statement that is the key. They said, we were hoping that he was the one. We were hoping that he was the Christ, he was the Messiah, he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Think about that. Their sadness was not based on who he was not based on what he had done or what he was continuing to do. Their sadness was based on their expectations, and their expectations were wrong. Do we ever have the wrong expectations? Maybe we're looking for the wrong thing from Jesus Christ. Maybe we want something different from God than what God wants for us. It's easy for us to think in terms of those things that are our wants as opposed to those things that are our needs. God has promised He will fulfill those things that we need in this life so that we might spend an eternity with Him. And yet sometimes we just expect the wrong thing. We don't get what we ask for, and like that child, we get disappointed or we get angry, or we start struggling in whether or not to even believe the person who has said something to us. Maybe a parent, or in this case for us, do we ever doubt God because we have the wrong expectations of what we are supposed to get in this life? Well, Jesus is going to keep going. I love that picture because this probably, at least to me, drives home the message that I need to make sure that I get. You can just picture them walking along the road, and Jesus is just going to keep going. It says he acted as if he was just going to keep walking as they were going to turn in where they were going. And they said, "Don't do that, please. It's getting late. The day is almost over." They certainly were involved in the conversation at that point, and they said, "Come in and stay with us." And so they invited Jesus in. What a great picture. Because the guest who was invited in became the host. And that is exactly what God wants to do in my life and wants to do in your life. But it is absolutely necessary. Before He can do that, I have to invite Him in. And I think that's one of the things I learned from these two. They invited Him in. Does that picture our lives? Because now that I've invited Him in, how much were their eyes opened when He is hosting my life? When He is the one that is directing where I go and what I do, the way I think, the way I act. I understand Him so much better. He journeys with me in this life. He opens the scriptures for me. He allows me to see things. He causes our hearts to burn like they said their hearts were burning. All because we have invited Him in, and He is now host of our life. Their lives were altered at that point. They were changed. They wanted Him to come in because they said, "It's almost nighttime. You need to come." But as soon as He broke bread with them, He disappeared. And what did they do? They got up, though it was almost evening, and they walked to Jerusalem. They couldn't sit still. They couldn't live their lives the way they had been living them, in sadness and discouragement and disappointment. They got up, it says, at that very hour, and they walked on. And they went to Jerusalem. They needed to spread the word to the others who were with them in hoping that Jesus was the one. And now they know He was the one. That it was their expectations that were flawed, not Jesus' execution of the plan that was flawed. And so they go and they explain, "We've seen Him." The story that the ladies told that we didn't really believe. We're telling you now, believe it. It's true. He is risen. He has come back, even as He promised. Has my life been altered? Because I invited Jesus in, and because He is now the host of my life. He walks with me, and He wants to walk with every one of us every day. He wants to help us so that he can open up his word and help us understand all the things that he has planned for us, all the glory that God should receive, and all the blessings that God will give. And so it really falls to one question for us. Do we invite him in? Or do we just allow him to continue and go on his way without us? Thank you for listening this morning.